The radio hissed once, then went dead. Raymond's hand froze mid-air. His breath caught. Max lifted his head, eyes locked on the dark, body already moving as if someone had called his name. "Don't let go." The words came back to Raymond the way they always did. Quiet, familiar. Born in a moment when holding on once meant staying alive. Halfway across the yard, he saw it. A mark in the snow where no human foot should be. Too large, too calm. Turned away from the road. For a second, Raymond remembered another night, another place, when holding on had felt like survival, and letting go had cost him sleep for years. Now Max stood still, torn between the leash and the forest, ears sharp, heart steady. Whatever crossed that land wasn't hunting, it was waiting. And in that moment, Raymond realized the forest hadn't come for him at all. It had come for the one thing he wasn't sure he could release. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The sound did not rise like a howl. It struck instead. Low, abrupt, heavy enough to shake the walls. Wood split somewhere beyond the dark, followed by the unmistakable rush of something large moving fast, too fast for caution. Raymond felt it before he named it, a tightening in his chest that cut his breath short, the kind that never came from dreams. The room seemed to pause around him, the quiet breaking not outward, but inward. Max was already on his feet, not barking, never barking. His body had shifted into a forward angle, ears rigid, weight set low, muscles pulled tight beneath dark fur as if an invisible line had snapped inside him. Raymond's hand closed around the leash by instinct, not thought, and the sudden force nearly wrenched his wrist as Max surged toward the back of the house. Gravel scraped beneath Raymond's boots as he followed, not shouting, not calling the dog's name, his heart finding an old rhythm he had learned to obey without question. The air outside felt dense, pressing against his lungs. Raymond moved the way he used to when hesitation cost more than speed. Shoulders forward, steps measured, attention narrowed to the space immediately ahead. Max pulled hard, nose low, then high again, reading the dark the way Raymond once read terrain maps under dim red light. Neither of them looked toward the road. Whatever had broken the night had not come from there. Behind the shed, the fence lay bent inward. One beam split clean through, the break sharp and fresh. Snow clung to the torn wood in uneven clumps, still settling, still alive with movement. Beyond it, pressed deep into the white, were tracks. Raymond stopped without meaning to. The leash went slack for half a breath, then tight again as Max slowed, his pull turning into a steady, forward lean. They were not human, not deer. The impressions were wide and sure, each step placed without hurry, without doubt, cutting across the property as though the boundary had never existed. They did not angle toward the road or curve away from the house. They passed through, direct and confident, as if following a line only they could see. Max halted suddenly. His chest rose once, then stilled. His tail did not move. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, eyes fixed on the tree line where shadow folded into deeper shadow. The night seemed to hold its breath with him. Raymond felt his own pulse slow, not calm, but alert, every sense sharpening into something close to reverence. For years, fear had announced itself clearly to Raymond. It came loud, hot, undeniable. This was not that. This was a pull, quiet and precise, threading its way through memory and muscle alike. Recognition, he realized, not of shape or sound, but of meaning. Whatever had crossed his land, had done so without panic. It had not fled. It had not hunted. It had moved like something that knew exactly where it belonged. Raymond shifted his weight, testing the ground, aware suddenly of the faint ache in his knee, the reminder of a past winter and a fracture that never quite let him forget. Max's shoulder brushed his leg briefly, a familiar point of contact, steady and grounding. There was a scar along Max's flank, pale against dark fur, earned years ago in a moment Raymond rarely revisited. He noticed it now without thinking, the way one notices old landmarks when returning to a place they swore they'd left behind. The radio at Raymond's belt crackled softly, a whisper of static that faded as quickly as it came. He did not reach for it. The habit remained, but the urgency did not. This was not something to be reported yet. Not something to be explained. The leash lay warm in his hand, the leather worn smooth where Max had pulled against it 1,000 times before, each time for a reason that later made sense. Snow continued to fall, light and patient, filling the edges of the tracks even as they studied them. Max lowered his head once more, inhaled deeply, then lifted his gaze back to the forest. His body did not strain forward now. He waited. Raymond watched the dog's eyes, the way their focus did not dart or harden, but held, attentive and open. There was no threat in that posture, only attention. Raymond crouched near the broken fence, fingers brushing the cold edge of splintered wood. He felt the faint vibration of something settling back into stillness, the land absorbing the disturbance. A memory brushed past him uninvited. Another night, another perimeter breached. The sound of movement mistaken for danger until it was too late. He let the thought pass without grabbing hold. That choice, too, had taken him years to learn. Max exhaled slowly. The sound was almost a sigh. Raymond realized then that his own shoulders had been raised, braced against an impact that did not come. He lowered them deliberately, feeling the tension drain in measured increments. The pull remained, subtle but persistent, not urging him forward, not warning him back, simply present. "Easy," Raymond said, the word low and reflexive, meant as much for himself as for the dog. Max did not look at him. He did not need to. The connection between them did not require confirmation in moments like this. It existed in the shared stillness, in the space where decision waited. The tree line stood dark and unbroken, no eyes reflecting, no sound rising to meet them. Yet Raymond knew with a certainty that unsettled him that they were not alone, not watched exactly, aware of, a presence acknowledged without demand. He tightened his grip on the leash by a fraction, not to pull Max back, but to feel the answer returned through muscle and bone. Max remained still, poised at the edge of motion, a creature balanced between command and instinct. The tracks disappeared into the forest without ceremony, swallowed by shadow and falling snow. Raymond straightened slowly, his gaze following them until they were gone entirely. The night closed around the space they had occupied, leaving behind only the broken fence and the imprint of something that had chosen its path without asking permission. For the first time in years, Raymond understood that some moments did not ask to be controlled. They asked to be recognized. He stood there with Max at his side, leash a quiet line between them, and felt the weight of a choice that had not yet been offered, but soon would be. The night had left a mark neither of them could name. Morning came without apology. The broken fence still leaned inward, its splintered beam catching the light in a way that made it impossible to pretend nothing had happened. Raymond stood a few steps back, arms loose at his sides, watching as the snow around the tracks hardened under the cold air. Max stayed close, not pacing, not restless, his posture alert but reserved, as if something inside him had already moved on to the next question. Sheriff Elaine Porter arrived just after the sun cleared the ridge. She was in her late 40s, hair pulled back tight beneath a knit cap, uniform worn smooth at the elbows, boots leaving careful prints beside the fence. 2 deputies followed her, younger, broader in their movements, their eyes moving quickly between the tracks and the tree line. Their breath clouded in short bursts, the kind that came from certainty rather than doubt. One of them crouched near the snow, gloved hand hovering over the impressions. He nodded once, already finished with the thought. "Mountain wolves," he said, quick and confident. "They pass through." Max did not move. Raymond noticed it immediately. Not tension, not resistance, but absence. The dog's attention was not on the deputy, not on the fence, not even on the tracks themselves. His gaze rested somewhere beyond them, fixed with a patience that did not belong to animals merely passing through. Elaine watched him for a moment longer than the others did, her expression shifting just enough to suggest she had seen dogs behave differently when something did not add up. They walked the perimeter together, boots crunching in uneven rhythm. Raymond answered questions with small nods and brief acknowledgments, offering no theory of his own. He had learned long ago that naming something too early could close doors that needed to stay open. Max followed the tracks only part way, his nose lowering, lifting, then stopping altogether, as if an invisible line had been drawn across the snow. He circled once, not wide, not hurried, a single deliberate loop that ended exactly where it began. Then Max turned back. He crossed the distance to Raymond without urgency and pressed his side firmly against the man's leg, the contact solid and unmistakable. Raymond felt the weight through his jeans, steady and grounding, the kind of pressure Max had used in other moments. Crowded rooms, loud nights, places where memory pressed too close. It was not fear. It was an alignment. Elaine's eyes followed the movement. She said nothing, but her shoulders eased slightly, as if she had just been handed a detail she did not yet know how to file. The deputies finished their inspection quickly, confidence intact, already moving toward the truck. The conclusion had been reached, even if the story had not. By late morning, the property returned to its usual stillness. The fence would be fixed later. The tracks softened under the sun, their edges losing definition. Raymond sat on the porch steps with a mug cooling between his hands, watching Max lie nearby, head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded but never fully closing. When the wind shifted, Max's ears moved first, adjusting to something Raymond could not hear. The afternoon stretched long and thin. Raymond walked the line where the tracks had been, noticing how they faded not outward, but inward, as if the snow itself had decided to keep their secret. Max rose once, followed the path again for a few yards, then stopped exactly where he had before. He did not push farther. He did not retreat. He stood, listening, then returned to Raymond without being called. It was then that Raymond understood the first truth, quiet but undeniable. Whatever had crossed his land had not been undecided. And Max, for reasons that had nothing to do with training, was choosing not to follow. Late in the afternoon, Raymond drove down the road to the neighboring ranch. The old man there had lived on the land longer than most fences had stood. His back was bent, his coat heavy and stained with years of weather, his eyes pale but sharp beneath the brim of a hat that had lost its shape. He leaned on the gate as Raymond approached, one hand wrapped around the wood as if it anchored him in place. The man did not look surprised to see him. He did not ask questions. He only glanced toward the hills before meeting Raymond's eyes again. His voice, when he spoke, was low and unhurried, worn smooth by time. "I've been hearing them for weeks," he said. "But not the kind that hunt, the kind that wait." Raymond felt the words settle slowly, like snow finding ground beneath the wind. He thanked the man and turned back before anything else could be added. Some statements did not improve with explanation. Dusk arrived quietly. The light thinned, stretching shadows long across the yard. Max sat near the porch, his body upright, his gaze locked on the forest, as though it were a doorway that had not yet decided whether to open. He did not bark. He did not whine. His breathing remained steady, measured, almost reverent. Raymond stood behind him, the leash looped loosely in his hand, not attached, not absent, simply there. He watched the way Max's muscles shifted beneath his coat as the wind moved through the trees, carrying with it something old and patient. When the breeze changed direction, Max rose in a single smooth motion, his weight shifting forward, then stopping. He stood there, balanced between two pulls, the trees ahead, the hand behind him. Raymond did not tighten his grip. He did not loosen it either. He understood now that the tension was not something to be resolved yet. It was something to be witnessed. The forest darkened by degrees, its edge blurring as night prepared to take its place again. Max remained standing, ears sharp, posture calm, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. Raymond felt the familiar "ugh" in his chest return, not sharp, not painful, but insistent. Between the world that held them and the one that called, nothing moved. Not yet. The forest had not come to take something. It had come to remind me. That truth settled into Raymond's sleep before he could resist it. The dream returned the way old wounds often did, without warning, without mercy. Another cold place, another stretch of silence so complete it rang in his ears. He stood there again, younger, shoulders squared, breath shallow, faced with a choice that had demanded speed when his heart had needed time. In the dream, he felt the weight of command settle heavy in his chest, and with it, the moment he chose wrong. Not loudly, not cruelly, but permanently. He woke before the dream could finish him. Max's paw rested lightly against his arm, not pressing, not urgent, just enough to bring him back. The dog's eyes were open, alert but calm, reflecting the faintest hint of dawn through the window. Raymond's breath came fast at first, then slowed as he placed a hand against Max's shoulder, grounding himself in the familiar rise and fall beneath his palm. Whatever the dream had carried with it, Max had not. They stepped outside before the sun fully claimed the sky. The world held its breath in that thin space between night and morning, the air sharp and clean enough to sting. Max moved ahead without pulling, his pace deliberate, guided by something older than command. Raymond followed, his joints stiff, his mind quieter now, but far from empty. Each step carried the echo of the dream, the awareness that memory did not weaken the strong. It tested how much they could still carry. The forest edge greeted them without ceremony. Snow lay undisturbed except where time had pressed it flat, its surface unbroken in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. Max slowed, ears lifting, breath steady but deepening as his attention narrowed. He did not rush. He did not hesitate. He led. They found the den where the ground dipped, and the trees grew closer together, their roots twisting into one another like fingers locked in warning. The hollow was old, abandoned. Snow filled its mouth, softened its edges, erased any sign of recent life. Raymond recognized the feeling immediately, the quiet of something that had once been necessary and no longer was. He had lived in places like this too. It was what lay beside the den that stopped them. A single paw print pressed deep into the snow, clean and unmistakable. Not scattered, not overlapping, just one. It faced back the way they had come, angled not toward the deeper forest, but toward the cabin, toward home. Raymond knelt without thinking. The cold soaked through his jeans as his fingers hovered, then brushed the edge of the impression. The snow there was compacted, deliberate, as if the animal had paused long enough to make sure it would be seen. Raymond felt his throat tighten, breath stalling for half a second before returning with a force that felt like relief. This was not a threat. It was an invitation. The realization did not come gently. It arrived, with the same clarity as the choices that had shaped his life, the ones that left no room for comfort afterward. He knew this feeling, the weight that settled when you understood that staying, however well-intentioned, might be the selfish act. He had mistaken holding on for protecting before. He had paid for it in silence. Behind him, Max stood very still, not braced, not tense, waiting. Raymond turned just enough to see the faint scar along Max's shoulder catch the growing light, the pale line tracing a history neither of them spoke about. Max's ears were forward, his posture open, his eyes steady on Raymond rather than the forest. It struck Raymond then, with a sharpness he had not expected, that Max was not asking to be released. He was asking to be understood. Memory rose again, unbidden. A younger Max, restless but obedient, learning the boundaries of human command. A night when Max had wanted to move, and Raymond had tightened the leash instead, choosing control over trust. Nothing catastrophic had followed, nothing immediate. But something had shifted quietly between them, a thread pulled just enough to fray. Raymond's hand trembled as he withdrew it from the snow. He rested it against his knee, then against the ground again, steadying himself. "I didn't know," he said softly, the words barely more than breath, offered to the cold rather than the dog. Max did not react. He did not need reassurance. He needed clarity. The forest did not answer. It did not move. It did not demand. It waited with the patience of something that understood time differently than men did. The den remained empty. The single print remained untouched. A message left without expectation of reply. Raymond stood slowly, the ache in his bones grounding him in the present. He looked once more at the print, then at the path leading back to the cabin. The direction mattered. Whatever had made that mark had turned away from the wild and toward what it recognized as familiar. Not to take, to acknowledge. Max shifted his weight, breath audible now in the cold air. His gaze flicked once toward the forest, then returned to Raymond. The choice was not his to make alone. It never had been. A sound moved through the trees then. Not a howl, not a footstep, but something in between. The soft displacement of snow. The sense of mass adjusting position. Raymond's muscles tightened instinctively, old reflexes flaring before he could stop them. Max did not move. His ears adjusted, his body remaining loose, ready but not alarmed. Something was coming. Not fast, not hidden. Approaching with the certainty of something that had already decided how this meeting would unfold. Raymond felt the weight of the moment settle around them, heavier than fear, heavier than doubt. He understood now why the forest had waited, why the mark had turned back. why Max had stopped following and started choosing. The strongest thing a man could do was not hold tighter. It was to know when to loosen his grip. Max took one step forward, then stopped, looking back over his shoulder at Raymond. The question in his eyes was not about safety, it was about permission. The forest was not hunting, it was calling. The storm came down from the ridge all at once, as if the mountain had grown tired of waiting. Snow thickened in the span of a breath, the air filling with white until distance lost its meaning. Wind cut sharp and low, slipping through seams, biting exposed skin, forcing Raymond to turn his body sideways just to stay upright. The path they had followed only minutes before vanished beneath fresh drifts, erased without ceremony, leaving no proof they had ever been there at all. Max was moving ahead when it happened, nose lifted briefly into the wind before dropping again, following a scent Raymond could not see and could barely imagine in weather like this. His footing gave way on a patch of hidden ice, the hind legs sliding out from under him. He caught himself quickly, but not before a short, pained sound escaped his throat, more startled than loud, gone almost as soon as it appeared. It was enough. Raymond was down beside him instantly, the world narrowing to fur, breath, and shaking hands. The storm roared on, indifferent, but his focus locked tight as his gloves came off and his fingers found the leg. He checked the joint the way his body remembered how to do, pressure measured, movements controlled, even as his pulse hammered. Max held still, eyes on Raymond's face, breath quick but steady, trusting him to read what the pain could not say. The leg swelled under his hands, tender at the joint, but it held when he tested it gently. No break, a sprain. The relief came hard and fast, nearly dropping Raymond forward as his breath left him in a cloud. He pressed his forehead briefly against Max's shoulder, feeling the heat there, the life, the familiar steadiness that had carried him through more nights than he could count. Snow piled into Max's coat, melting and freezing again, turning dark fur pale and heavy. Raymond shifted his jacket to shield him from the worst of the wind, aware now of the tremor in his own arms. It was not just cold. It was the weight of the moment catching up to him. The realization that this was no longer a distant possibility, but a price already being paid. They moved together, slowly, each step deliberate. Raymond took some of Max's weight, not lifting, not dragging, just enough to keep the injured leg from folding again. Max adjusted his stride without protest, breathing in short, controlled bursts, his body aligning with Raymond's as if they had practiced this exact moment. The storm closed in around them, shrinking the world to a narrow corridor of white and sound. Visibility collapsed until the ridge was gone, then the tree line, then even the sense of direction threatened to slip away. Raymond relied on memory and muscle, counting steps, angling his body into the wind the way he once had, in places where losing your line meant losing more than time. Max's breathing became the measure of progress, each inhale and exhale anchoring Raymond to the present when fatigue pressed hard against his chest. It was in that narrowing space, with the storm stripping away everything unnecessary, that the truth finally took shape. Max wasn't being pulled away. Max was being held back. The understanding did not arrive gently. It cut through Raymond's fear with a clarity that left him exposed. All this time, all the tension and vigilance, he had believed he was protecting Max from the forest. But the weight in his hands told a different story. He had been protecting himself from the risk of choosing wrong again, from the quiet cost of letting go. Lights appeared through the snow like something imagined at first, faint and pulsing, then solid enough to trust. A vehicle angled against the wind, hazard lights blinking slow and steady, marking a point of refuge in a landscape that refused to offer any. Relief followed, tempered by the knowledge that shelter did not equal resolution. Sheriff Elaine Porter stepped out into the storm with careful economy, her movements practiced, her presence grounded. Snow clung to her coat, her breath visible as she closed the distance between them. Her eyes went first to Max's leg, then to Raymond's hands still braced against the dog's side, reading the story without needing it told. "You don't owe the woods anything," she said, her voice carrying just enough to cut through the wind. The words were meant to be kind. They were meant to offer permission of a different sort, to turn back, to choose safety without guilt. Raymond felt the weight of them settle, felt how easily he could accept them and let the moment close around that choice. For a second, the path was clear and simple. Max shifted, testing the injured leg, then lifted his head. His gaze moved past Raymond, past the sheriff, past the vehicle and its lights, toward the blurred edge where trees dissolved into storm. There was no urgency in that look, no fear, just attention, deep and patient, as if he were listening for something that did not raise its voice even now. Raymond followed that gaze and felt the pull again. Not sharp, not demanding, but present. Survival pressed in on all sides, real and immediate. Yet it was not the question tightening his chest. The question waiting for him had nothing to do with getting out of the storm. Only one chance remained, and it wasn't about survival. It was about permission. He adjusted his grip on Max, not to hold him closer, but to steady him, to let the dog feel the choice moving through his hands rather than against them. Max's muscles responded, subtle and sure, the quiet language between them flowing without effort. The storm continued to erase tracks behind them as fast as they were made, insisting on now, on the moment that could not be postponed. Elaine waited, reading the stillness with the same care she brought to scenes others rushed through. She did not press. She did not argue. She understood that this decision belonged to a place no badge or rule could reach. Raymond looked down at Max, at the ice clinging to his whiskers, at the steady focus in his eyes despite the pain. He thought of the nights he had tightened the leash without realizing it, of the choices that felt safe in the moment and heavy years later. He thought of the single paw print turned back toward the cabin, of the way the forest had waited instead of taken. The wind shifted slightly, opening a narrow pocket of calm around them. It would not last. Nothing did. But it was enough to remind him that moments like this were never given time, only courage. Max held his position, legs sore, body balanced, waiting, not asking to be released, not asking to be led, waiting to know who he was allowed to be now, and whether Raymond trusted him enough to honor that. Raymond drew a breath that reached deeper than his lungs. The fear remained. It always would. But beneath it lay something steadier, shaped by loss, regret, and the slow work of learning to listen. He understood now that holding on and letting go were not opposites. They were choices, each with a cost, and only one belonged to this moment. The storm pressed close again, time tightening around them. Elaine shifted her stance, ready to act if called upon. The lights pulsed, counting seconds in red and amber. Max's gaze never left the trees. One last chance, or none at all. Raymond stood between the world that held him and the one that called, feeling the weight of the decision settle fully into his hands. Loving something doesn't always mean keeping it close. Dawn arrived without ceremony, easing its pale light across the snow as if the night had finally loosened its grip. The storm had passed, leaving the forest rinsed clean and strangely still, every branch outlined in quiet silver. Raymond stood on the porch for a long moment before moving, listening to the way the world breathed now that nothing was chasing it. Max waited beside him, weight balanced carefully on his injured leg, eyes steady, neither restless nor resigned. They walked together toward the tree line, the leash resting loose in Raymond's hand. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the slow certainty settling in his chest. The yard ended where the forest began, a boundary he had crossed many times before without thinking. Today, it felt different, clearer, sharper, like a line drawn not in snow, but in understanding. Raymond knelt when they reached it, the motion slow and deliberate. He rested his forehead against Max's, breathing in the familiar warmth, the scent of fur and cold air mixed together. For years, this closeness had meant safety. Holding on had been his language of care. He stayed there longer than he meant to, as if time itself might soften if he waited long enough. In the stillness, the truth finally arranged itself without resistance. The sound in the night had not been a warning. The fence had not been broken in panic. The tracks had not fled toward the road. The den they found had been old, not claimed, not defended, and the single paw print, pressed deep and turned back toward the cabin, had never been meant to threaten. It had been meant to be seen. The howls the rancher spoke of were not the cries of hunters. They were signals of presence, of patience, of something circling the edges of a life that had paused too long. The forest had not been calling Max away from Raymond. It had been calling him back to himself. Raymond felt the weight of that realization settle into places words could not reach. He thought of another cold place from long ago, another silence that demanded a choice. Back then, he had held on because letting go felt like failure. He had mistaken control for responsibility, obedience for loyalty. The cost of that decision had not arrived all at once. It had unfolded slowly, in years of unrest and quiet regret. Here, now, the moment asked something different of him. His hands rested on either side of Max's neck, thumbs brushing the fur there, the urge rising sharp and sudden, to tighten his grip, to anchor what he loved where he could still feel it. The fear was honest. It did not pretend to be noble. It came from memory, from knowing how easily a wrong choice could echo. Max did not pull away. He stayed. His body remained steady beneath Raymond's hands, his breath warm and even despite the pain in his leg. There was no tension in him, no impatience. He leaned in, just slightly, a quiet act of trust that cut deeper than resistance ever could. He was not asking to be taken. He was waiting to be understood. Raymond's fingers trembled. He felt the battle play out not in his thoughts, but in his muscles, in the instinct to hold and the harder discipline of release. He thought of the leash, of how often it had been tight without his noticing. He thought of the nights Max had waited, alert and silent, for a permission that never came because fear had spoken first. Slowly, so slowly it barely felt like movement, Raymond loosened his grip, not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to let the choice pass through his hands instead of stopping there. Something inside him broke open, not in collapse, but in surrender. The fear did not disappear, but it no longer led. For the first time, he did not brace against what might be lost. He made space for what needed to be true. Max shifted, testing the space Raymond had made. He stepped forward once, then paused. He turned his head back, pressing his muzzle briefly against Raymond's chest, right where the heartbeat lived. It was not a plea. It was a promise kept. The leash slipped free without a sound, falling slack against the snow. Max did not rush. He did not bolt. He took one measured step into the forest, then another, moving with a familiarity that made the trees seem less like a boundary and more like an extension of himself. Snow brushed his sides. Branches parted without resistance. He walked as if he had always known this path, as if the waiting had simply reached its end. He turned back once. There was no confusion in his eyes, no fear, only gratitude, quiet, steady, complete. It was not goodbye. It was an acknowledgement, the kind that passes between beings who have walked a long distance together and know exactly what has been given. Then Max continued into the forest, his form dissolving gently into shadow and light until he was no longer separate from it. Raymond did not follow. This time, staying was the brave choice. He remained kneeling long after Max was gone from sight, the silence settling around him in layers. The forest did not answer. It did not need to. Everything it had asked for had been offered freely. The bond between them had not broken. It had changed shape. When Raymond finally stood, the ache in his body felt different, lighter, honest. He walked back toward the cabin alone, the snow crunching softly beneath his boots. The world no longer pulled at him from opposite directions. It simply existed, wide enough to hold both memory and release. At the edge of the yard, he stopped and looked back toward the trees. For a moment, just one, he thought he saw movement between the trunks, a familiar silhouette pausing where light met shadow. It did not come closer. It did not need to. Raymond raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement. The forest held the gesture without comment. Behind him, the cabin waited, not as a place of keeping, but of remembering. Ahead of him, the trees breathed, carrying a loyalty that had never been lost, only freed. Max had left, but nothing was taken away. Spring arrived slowly, the way it does in places that remember winter too well. Snow thinned first at the edges, along the fence posts beneath the south-facing trees. Before retreating in small, patient steps, Raymond marked the days without counting them, noticing only the changes that mattered. The sound of meltwater threading through the low ground, the way light lingered a minute longer each evening, the return of birds that tested the air as if it might still betray them. He walked the fence line each morning, boots steady on thawing earth, hands loose at his sides. Some days, fresh tracks appeared near the trees, clean impressions pressed into the softening ground, unmistakable even when he pretended not to look for them. Some days, there were none. He learned to accept both with the same quiet breath, understanding that presence did not need to be constant to be real. The cabin settled into a new rhythm. Windows opened wider. The radio stayed silent more often than not. Raymond found himself pausing in doorways, listening, not for footsteps, not for a familiar weight against his leg, but for the softer things he had missed before. The wind moving through branches, the creak of wood warming under the sun, his own breath no longer tight with vigilance. The absence was not empty. It was shaped, deliberate like space left on purpose. He tended the small tasks that anchored him, mending a post, clearing fallen limbs, stacking wood that no longer felt urgent. Each motion carried the memory of another body moving beside him, not as ache but as companionship that had simply changed its address. He did not rush these moments. He let them take the time they asked for. On certain mornings, He knelt where the yard met the forest and pressed his palm to the ground, feeling the cool give beneath his skin. The earth was alive there, busy with its own work. He thought of how many times he had mistaken stillness for loss, and how wrong he had been. Life did not always announce itself with movement. Sometimes it waited to be noticed. The days lengthened. Green returned in hesitant strokes, first as moss brightening stones, then as blades of grass daring the cold nights, then as buds swelling on branches that had learned to endure. Raymond watched it all with the kind of attention that comes after a hard lesson, when the world feels newly precise. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the light turned honeyed, he stood at the edge of the clearing with his hands resting easy at his sides. The air held that brief balance between warmth and chill, a promise neither fully kept nor withdrawn. He felt it before he saw it, the shift that had nothing to do with sound. Max emerged briefly at the edge of the trees. Older, the line of his body leaner now, his movements measured with a confidence that came from belonging where he stood. Wilder in the way his coat caught the light and refused to be tamed by it. Still himself, unmistakably so, the steadiness in his posture unchanged by distance. He did not come closer. He did not need to. Raymond did not move either. He felt the moment settle, felt how easily he could step forward and how much strength it took not to. The space between them was not an obstacle. It was an understanding. He raised a hand, not a summons, not a goodbye, just an acknowledgement carried on the open air. Max watched for a long moment, his ears lifted, then eased. His gaze held Raymond's without urgency, without question. There was no calculation in it, no asking to be named or claimed, only recognition, complete and sufficient. Then Max turned back into the forest. The light lingered after he was gone, as if reluctant to leave the clearing empty. Raymond stayed where he was, letting the warmth touch his face, letting the quiet arrive fully before he turned toward the cabin. He did not follow. He did not call out. He trusted the choice they had made to keep meaning without repetition. That night, he slept with the windows open. The sounds of the forest moved through the room in slow waves, branches settling, distant water, the low, unhurried breath of a place at ease with itself. He dreamed of nothing urgent. When he woke, the morning found him rested in a way that felt earned. Days passed, then more. The tracks appeared again once, close enough that he smiled without realizing it. Another time, they did not. Both were gifts. He learned the difference between waiting and watching, between longing and listening. He learned how a bond could remain intact without insisting on proximity. On a morning washed clean by rain, Raymond stood on the porch and felt the sun lift the last of the cold from his shoulders. He thought of all the names he had given love over the years: duty, protection, keeping, and how narrow they had been. What he understood now was wider and kinder. Love did not end when someone leaves. Sometimes it finally learns how to breathe. He carried that truth with him as he went about the day, not as a lesson to be repeated, but as a quiet companion. The forest held its own life. The cabin held his. Between them, the path remained open, not as a line to cross, but as a reminder that freedom and memory could share the same ground. At dusk, he stepped outside once more and looked toward the trees. The clearing answered with stillness. Raymond smiled, raised his hand again, this time to no one in particular, and turned back inside as the light eased into night. The world felt large enough to hold what had been, and gentle enough to welcome what would come. Here, At the quiet edge after everything has settled, what remains is not the noise of what was lost, but the calm of what was honored. There is a kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't demand to be seen. It simply stays true, even when paths no longer run side by side. And there is a courage that looks nothing like bravery in the moment. Only later does it reveal itself as the strength to trust, to release, to believe that love is not weakened by distance. What lingers most is the gentleness, the small, steady kindness that survives fatigue, the patience to listen instead of hold tighter, the hope that doesn't rush in all at once, but arrives slowly. The way to rest comes after a long season of being awake. These are not lessons shouted across time. They are understandings carried quietly, felt more than spoken. Some stories don't end when the moment passes. They end when the heart finally knows it did right. If this story stayed with you longer than you expected, you're welcome to sit a while longer. There are other quiet roads, other gentle truths waiting to be told, whenever you feel ready to listen again.